Despite widespread adoption of new educational standards for financial advisors, the discussion about how to treat those currently working in the sector is continuing, with potential plans from both sides of Parliament to recognise the experience and qualification of practitioners. Joining me today is Judith Fox, Chief Executive Officer with the Stockbrokers and Investment Advisors Association, which has argued for some time for this recognition. Judith, can you briefly unpack the views of your members on this issue?
Thanks, Jason, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. I mean, our view is that we support both the experience and the qualification pathway for particular reasons. Let me start with experience. We really don't want to leave the experience, we don't lose the experienced people in our industry. A, they're the mentors for the next generation. B, we don't want to see all those orphaned clients. And if we look at other professions where they introduced a sort of mandatory university degree qualification to enter the profession, we've never seen a situation where experienced people have just been jettisoned. So if I think about nurses, for example, when degrees were introduced, we didn't get rid of all our experienced nurses. And we also didn't say that they had to go back and get a university degree. We understood they were the mentors of the next generation. My father was a lawyer. He never went to university. He went through the old article clerk system. No one said to him when he was 60 that he had to go back and do a university degree. It was understood that you keep your experience and then you make sure that every new person coming into the profession has a university qualification. So we've always struggled with the idea that the experienced people should somehow be forced to either go back and study, especially for our industry. All of the approved degrees were in financial planning, which is not what our members do. And that leads me to the expanded qualification pathway. Our concern there is that FASEA only approved financial planning degrees or degrees with financial planning majors, and that's not what our members do. Our members come into the industry primarily with degrees in commerce, finance, economics, and business. Because if you think about stockbrokers and investment advisors, they're not providing advice on taxation or aged care or Centrelink benefits or insurance. What they're doing is they're monitoring company balance sheets, they're doing sector analyses, they're looking at the macro and micro impacts on equity investments. I mean, just look at what's happening with Ukraine at the moment and what that's doing to markets. So it's a fundamentally different financial advice service. So we really think now that there's recognition from both the government and the opposition that the financial advice system is a broad ecosystem, and financial planning is only one part of it, a very important part, and our members work hand in hand with financial planners, but it is already a specialisation itself, and trying to sort of funnel everyone through that one sort of financial advice pathway clearly hasn't worked, and we've seen how it's had an impact on the access to and affordability of advice. We've lost 40% of our financial advisors over the last few years. And of course, costs have gone up, and that's also a regulatory issue. But that's why, hopefully, I've explained in a nutshell why we are so supportive of the two pathways. We feel that there's recognition in both of those elements, that this is a broad ecosystem. There are different financial advice services being offered to different consumer needs. Like if I go to a stockbroker, I'm looking for something very different from when I go to a financial planner. And we really want to keep our experience. And again, in our industry, we've been in a bull market. Markets don't always go up. We certainly don't want to lose the experience that have been through the GFC, the Asian financial crisis, even sometimes the market crash of '87. Those people with that degree of experience, that's just gold. When markets go volatile, when there are market corrections, it's people who've been there before that keep everything steady.
This recognition of the experience and qualification of advisors is not an issue in isolation. And Judith, at the association's upcoming conference, you'll be chairing a session on whether the advice sector can survive after a wave of regulatory change, or will a total rethink be required? Can you outline for us why you see it as those two choices?
I don't know that I necessarily see it is about those two choices, but there's a lot of sort of commentary that somehow it is. And so we thought, let's have a session where we can unpack that. And like most things, there's probably a much more nuanced view in there. Having said that, I do think that there again is recognition across the entire financial advice industry and from government, opposition, regulators, that the regulatory reform pendulum has probably swung too far. We've been treated to a tsunami of regulatory reform over the last few years. And as a result, we have seen access to and affordability of advice decrease. Now, all of the reform was well-intentioned, but the outcomes haven't necessarily aligned with the intention of the reform. So we've got the Quality of Advice Review coming up this year. We've got the Australian Law Reform Commission examination of Chapter 7 and whether it can be streamlined. We've seen its interim report, which shows that the law is so complicated and spread over so many levels that it's almost impossible to understand, follow. Now, that makes compliance difficult. That means compliance costs go up. But is there actually a benefit to that? So their suggestions about streamlining Chapter 7 make a lot of sense. So I think there's this recognition that the regulatory reform process hasn't always achieved the outcomes that it wanted, even though it was well-intentioned, that surely we need to now come in and have a bit of a look and see, what can we do to actually make the law work better, which also accords with Commissioner Hayne in the Royal Commission. He said it's not that the law needs changing, it needs to work better. So we don't need to add more and more regulation, but maybe we can actually start to pull some of it back, keep the intention, achieve the intention, but not necessarily have it quite so prescriptive, not necessarily have it burdening the sector to the detriment ultimately of the client. So, and then I guess at that session, we want to also unpack the opportunities. If we don't need a complete regulatory rethink, but we do need some changes, what are the opportunities that the reform process has opened up? And I think that's going to be a really interesting discussion, because we do have 40% fewer advisors in the system, certainly in the stockbroking and investment advice sector, because of the very narrow experience, lack of experience pathway and the very narrow educational qualifications pathway, we have seen an exit of some very sort of experienced advisors. So what are the opportunities? And I think that's a really interesting one, because what we are seeing is baby boomers, as they retire, are coming into extraordinary amounts of money, more than they've often ever had in their lives. We're seeing an intergenerational wealth transfer occurring. The Productivity Commission says 3.5 trillion over the next 2 decades. Australians need access to good advice at this point in time more than ever before. So there are opportunities, but we want to make sure that that regulatory framework supports it. And whether it's a binary choice, I don't think it is, but let's have the discussion about what's the nuance in that question.
While the changes in advice have been taking place, there's also been changes in the investment management value chain, with the movement to passive investing and online DIY investing. Judith, what challenges are these creating for advisors providing investment advice?
Well, we've seen a change in consumer behaviour in every single part of our sort of environment. And so if we look at the trading apps, you know, we've got a generation now who are used to being able to secure everything online. And so you really are only as good as your app. And your app's being compared with Uber. It's being compared with, you know, some great apps that are out there. So it's totally understandable how, especially younger generations, have really gone for trading apps. But I'll come back to a point I made earlier. We've been in a bull market. Markets don't always go up. And so at the moment, there's a whole generation and a whole cohort of investors who think, you know, possibly I'm a genius, I'm always making money. But it's when markets actually go into volatile territory or when there are market corrections that the value of an advisor, an investment advisor, really comes into their own. And so the challenge has been that we've had these two sort of things of passive investing and do-it-yourself trading, which have got a lot of people into the market. That's a good thing. The challenge now is, how do we articulate the value for people of seeking advice as their wealth sort of generates further, and that is actually a value add for them. And it's a partnership, if you like, because they've already got some skills, they've already got some ideas about how to operate in markets, but you can actually do even better if you're working with an advisor. And one of the things is simply having a strategy, an investment strategy, and staying steady when things go pear-shaped, because they do in markets from time to time, And sometimes the value of an advisor is someone who can just give you that emotional stability, because if it's the first time you've experienced a market correction, it can be terrifying.
More detail on these topics will be covered at the Stockbrokers and Investment Advisors Association Conference in Sydney and online on the 24th and 25th of May. There, the conference will include addresses from the Minister for Superannuation, Financial Services and the Digital Economy, Senator Jane Hume, the Shadow Minister for Financial Services, Stephen Jones, and ASIC Chair Joseph Longo, as part of a lineup of more than 40 speakers and 23 sessions. To register, head to stockbrokers.org.au. Thanks, Judith, for your time. We look forward to seeing you at the conference.
Thanks, Jason. See you there.